Welcome. My apologies to those attending today's meeting that we're getting started a little bit late. This is a little bit rare for us, so again, my apologies. Welcome to the January 10th, 2013 meeting of the National Capital Planning Commission. If you would please stand with me for the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. I will note for everyone in attendance that today's meeting is being live streamed on the web. It's on the NCPC website, so all comments are very public. And we do have a quorum, and so I'd like to call the meeting to order and proceed under the agenda that has been publicly posted. Item number one is the report of the chairman, and I don't have a report other than to say that what some of you may know is that President Obama has reappointed me to chair the National Capital Planning Commission for a term of 6 years, commencing today. Through January of 2018, and I look forward to continue serving alongside you, learning from you, and trying to match your own considerable contributions. Agenda item number two is the report of the Executive Director.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations on your reappointment, and Happy New Year's to all the commissioners and to the public. Just a few notes. First of all, the Commission's 2012 annual report is available. It's in front of you at your desk today, and is currently being distributed to the public. I'd like to thank the commissioners for your participation in preparing this document, and hope that you find it interesting and a good reflection on what this commission has done over the last year. Second, the public meeting for the draft comprehensive plan visitor and commemoration element. We're going to have a public meeting on Wednesday, February 20th, 6 p.m. here at NCPC office, and so we'd like to invite members of the public and commission to attend that. I do have a few personnel notes. After over 41 years of federal service, including 15 years at NCPC, Jody Reeder, who is our Director of Administration and our Chief Information Officer, has retired this month. Jody provided the highest level of service to the staff and the Commission, and will miss his positive attitude, calm demeanor, and willingness to go the extra mile. We thank Jody for his service to NCPC and wish him well in his retirement. Also, Planner Sarah Moulton has accepted a position as Planning and Design Officer with the D.C. Parks and Recreation Department. Sarah's worked with the Commission for 3 years and contributed significantly to the Southwest Eco District Initiative, which you're going to hear today, and the Federal Triangle Study. Also, Staff Assistant Long Diep, who has worked with the Commission since 2008, has left the Office of Secretary to become an Administrative Specialist at the Department of Army's Office of the Chief of Staff. We wish both Sarah and Long the best in their future endeavors. Finally, we do have a delegated action item which two members of the public have requested to speak before the Commission. This is a delegated action that is a federal interest review of a D.C. Zoning Commission case, ZC 11-03A, which is a project at the wharf, which is on the southwest waterfront. And this is in practice with the Commission's hearing speakers during my Executive Director's report. I'd like to, with your consent, Mr. Chairman, to invite both Mr. Gene Sullivan to come up first, representing the residents of the southwest waterfront area. And then we also have Mr. Sean Seaman, who's representing the developer of that project.
Thank you, Mr. Costa. Is Mr. Sullivan here? Please. And as you're coming up and introducing yourself, I will say that should any member of the Commission want to move this from the delegated section to an action item, that's your prerogative to do so, but it's not necessary. But Mr. Sullivan, welcome.
Thank you. I'm Gene Sullivan, twice elected former member of the Board of Directors of Harbor Square Southwest DC Waterfront Housing Cooperative. Continue to work hard for a high-quality Southwest DC waterfront redevelopment project that respects community residents and visitors alike, preserves viewsheds, meets the highest architectural and construction and environmental protection standards. Although some adjustments have recently been made, the proposed wharf project is still, even at this late stage, so far from meeting such standards that I straightforwardly continue to register my opposition to it as proposed. Commissioners, I respectfully but strongly suggest that there are vitally important things you must do before you continue to grant approvals to WARF project proposed components, sections, and stages. Here are some of those things. Please require the D.C. Department of Transportation to provide to you and to the community a detailed traffic congestion prevention plan, a plan that will prevent the HSW proposed WARF project from generating traffic that monitoring shows will overtax our infrastructure. Please do not proceed to approve the WARF project until we possess an adequate traffic congestion prevention plan. Please do all you can to get the church-owned buildings on parcels 11A and B to meet both LEED construction and stormwater standards, and please require written documentation that project site soil is free of harmful contaminants, and that there will be no waterfront park events plaza or any other space designated for events featuring a sound stage or any other surface from which loud music or amplified voices or bright light is meant to emanate. Commissioners, please require that cruise ship boarding and debarking and all other commercial cruise ship activity be moved away from the Tiber Island Harbor Square residential area northward toward the 14th Street Bridge complex. Commissioners, if you permit the applicant to intrude into the lovely Washington Channel with concrete and wood piers and docks right up to the edge of the 240-foot strip of Federal Navigation Channel, no less, you cramp the space for the teaching of and participation in recreational sailboating, dragon boating, canoeing, and kayaking, just threatening the safety of trainees and others engaged in piloting small boats. If you're dedicated to something or other called vibrancy, sailboating, dragon boating, canoeing, and kayaking over a wider water area will bring more and healthier and more aesthetic vibrancy to the Washington Channel than will ever be brought by some extra sales and rentals at unnecessary overextensions of piers, docks, and boat slips. Further, there does exist a U.S. Department of Defense harbor safety standard, and it clearly applies to the main Washington Channel passageway, not to the distance between slip ends, as the Baltimore Army Corps of Engineers has claimed. Allowing the insertion of more boat slips and netting boats into the multipurpose harbor while constricting emergency evacuation passageway is not responsible planning. Your agency's mandate is to protect the treasured Washington Channel and those who enjoy it from such harm. Commissioners, at long last, you must expose as grotesque the applicant's pitch that longer piers and docks provide in evacuation scenarios a community good, elongated staging areas. As I've already pointed out, people massed in those staging areas may be doomed to die there because, of course, the longer piers and docks severely constrict their escape route, their water passageway to safety. Commissioners, it is up to you to limit the lengthening of Washington Channel piers and docks, consistent with Anacostia Waterfront Initiative and other relevant standards. It is your agency's mandated prerogative to do that very necessary thing in order to protect extremely important safety and aesthetic attributes of the Washington Channel, a national treasure that's at least as impressive as any statue of a man on a horse. Attachment 3 to my full testimony contains copies of the signatures of well over 100 Southwest Waterfront area residents who implore you to make informed, wise, and humane decisions. We thank you for attention to our pleas.
Thank you, Mr.
I
Sullivan.
now wish you a Happy New Year. I would have done it at the beginning, but I was told it would be on my time.
Thank you, Mr. Sullivan, very much. Mr. Seaman, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is Sean Seaman. I'm a principal with P.N. Hoffman & Associates. We're the managing member of the redeveloper of the Southwest Waterfront, also known as the WARF. Parcel 11, which is before you today, is a portion of our Phase 1 development. It's about a 1-acre site that's bound by Main Avenue, Water Street, 6th Street Southwest, and M Place Southwest. We're working on the project in cooperation with the Vestry of St. Augustine's Church, which is the owner of the site. The church currently occupies the site today. The church had hoped to redevelop their site, and in doing so has partnered with P.N. Hoffman and Madison Marquette to provide residential and a church mixed-use development on the site. It's about a 16,000 square foot church on 2 floors. It's a 4-story residential building with an occupied penthouse that measures about 57 feet. We have 109 residential condominium units. The area was rezoned in 2011 through the PUD remapping process from R3 to R5B. The balance of the Southwest Waterfront project is zoned C3C. We feel that the 57-foot residential building of 110 units and the 16,000 square foot church are consistent with the district's comprehensive plan, are consistent with our Stage 1 plan unit development approval that was approved in 2011 by the District Zoning Commission. And we hope that you'll agree with the staff report that there's no finding of adverse impact on any federal interest caused by the project. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Questions or comments among commission members? Hearing none.
I'll just thank both of our both gentlemen for appearing before the National Capital Planning Commission today. And just note that Mr. Solon was also made a presentation before the Zoning Commission, and I believe that, for my part, I'm happy to keep this matter a delegated item. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Hearing no other comments, again, we thank you very much for your participation. Agenda item number 3 is the legislative update. Ms. Schuyler?
Legislative update.
Oh, coming at me from all.
I'm sorry.
I'll try to get it right this time. I would like to defer what I was going to report on until next month, so therefore I have nothing to say.
Okay, thank you very much. Agenda item number 4 is the consent calendar. And we have 4 items on the consent calendar, and they are as follows. Item 4A is the temporary renewal of the public telescope and observatory at the National Air and Space Museum. 4B is Phase 2 of the Dulles Metro Rail project. 4C is a modification of the general development plan for the Anacostia Stream Valley Park. And last, 4D is an amendment to the federal visitors element of the comprehensive plan. Any questions or comments on the consent calendar?
Mr. Chairman, I just have to note for the record that I have recused myself from the Metro Rail project application submission just because of my role at the WMATA board.
Thank you very much. So noted. The 4 items on the consent calendar, any other discussion? Hearing none, is there a motion?
So moved.
It's been moved and seconded, the consent calendar. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. It's adopted. Agenda item number 5A is the Southwest Eco District, and we have Ms. Sullivan. And as Ms. Sullivan comes before you today is acceptance of the Southwest Eco District plan. It's a vision document that our staff has spent and a task force has spent the better part of 2 or 3 years working on, along with a lot of extended consultants. And while this is not a commentary on the many other great things that we do, I will say that, in my opinion, the Southwest Eco District plan and the work that has gone into it, speaking for myself, is the favorite thing I've worked on. I think it's just extraordinary in the product that we have before us. Ms. Sullivan, welcome.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the Commission. It's my pleasure, and I mean that, to present the work of the Southwest Eco District Task Force to you today and to ask for your acceptance of the Southwest Eco District Plan. And before I begin, I do want to extend my thanks and gratitude to the Southwest Eco District Task Force, this Commission, NCPC staff, the working group, and all of the agency staff who have worked on this, and also to Elizabeth Miller, who very much wanted to be here today, who has led this project for the past few years since the beginning and could not be here with us today. So with that...
and let's not forget Bill Dowd, who...
Of course, who's on detail, but you know, yes.
He's with us in spirit.
That's right. So if you recall, we were back in front of you this past July reviewing the draft plan, and at that time we held a public meeting and issued it for a 60-day public comment period. During that time we briefed Congresswoman Norton, the Office of Management and Budget, different federal and local stakeholder agencies, including the President's Council on Environmental Quality. We also spent a lot of time doing additional outreach. We've been asked to speak about the work of the task force actually all over the country. It was a very busy fall for us. And this all culminated with us presenting the final plan to the task force in early December, and they approved the plan and agreed to forward it to this commission for your acceptance here today. So it's been very exciting. It has been about 3 years since we embarked on this planning effort. And so because I've already reviewed with you the crux of the plan before, I'm not going to go into all the strategies in detail today. However, there are a couple of areas that I do want to touch on, some key highlights, because there is so much underway in this area, and because we will actually be back in front of you probably as early as this May with related follow-up work. And so those highlights are why this plan is important, what we can achieve for this federal office enclave, what we've heard from the public and the stakeholders and how we've addressed this in the final plan, and where we're headed. So this plan is very important just because so much is underway right now. As many of you know, GSA issued a request for information for the area defined as Federal Triangle South. That's 22 acres of this eco-district area. Actually, that's just including the sites themselves, not even the streets. And basically what they are doing here is using, what they seek to do is leverage their resources here to meet the needs of their client agencies, and to the extent possible meet the goals and objectives of the Southwest Eco District Plan. We all know that GSA is looking at re-examining their property in terms of a modernizing workforce, meeting sustainability goals, and of course with the fact that they have very little money to modernize some of their properties today. So that's going on. They are also looking at the future of the Central Utility Plant. This is also a very important key strategy to the Southwest Eco District Plan, the idea of a district energy system, and GSA is coordinating that work with the process of the RFI. The city is investing $2 million in the Maryland Avenue Transportation Study, which basically takes the next step from the small area plan that they completed last summer, and is really studying the technical feasibility of decking Maryland Avenue, which is very, very exciting. The city is also working on the Long Bridge Capacity Study, which has important, that's looking at the rail capacity over the Long Bridge, and that has very important implications for what happens at L'Enfant Station, another key strategy of the Southwest Eco District Plan. And then you have what's happening on the private sector. Obviously, the wharf is breaking ground this year, which is very exciting. The multi-billion-dollar waterfront development proposal that we actually just heard about. JBG is considering or has introduced a concept for a 130-foot building in the plaza area of the L'Enfant Plaza complex. This is in addition to the extended stay hotel and the office building that are already further along. And then finally, the property owners in this area, and actually outside of our eco-district area, are contemplating a business improvement district, which is an exciting tool for the possible implementation of some of the ideas in the Southwest Eco District Plan. So they're looking beyond, your typical bid functions, and looking to be more of a partner in this process as well. I don't think any of us would have thought at this point that this much would be underway just a couple of years after starting this plan, and that's really, I think, what makes this all the more timely and critical. So you'll recall that, and you've heard these many times before, but I always have to go back to them, and this will be the last time you hear them from me, that our goals were to transform the 10th Street and Maryland Avenue corridors into a highly sustainable, well-connected mixed-use community, and to create an environmental showcase of high-performance buildings and landscapes. And with this, we're calling this area an eco-district. And what we mean by this is that we're planning at a district scale, not the individual building scale, and we think we can do better in terms of our environmental systems, our transportation, if we plan at this scale. This is really important for the federal government because in order to meet Executive Order 13514, we don't think we can meet the goals and requirements without planning at this scale with regard to energy and water. It's also important to the federal government as a property owner because we believe it's more financially feasible for us to plan this way. So it's not, with all this stuff underway, it's not very hard to imagine now a brand new connection between the Smithsonian Castle and Banneker Park down to the waterfront, smaller building footprints, a more vibrant mix of uses, and trees throughout this area. A new Virginia Avenue, a new Department of Energy headquarters, and just a way to sort of blur the federal city with the local city in a much better way than what we do now. A new vibrant 10th Street that manages all of its stormwater from the area, holds the pipes for the district energy system, but also is an exciting exhibit space, holds farmers markets, and is way more active than what it is today. And then finally, a new gateway to the National Mall from the south, starting with the signature landscape at Banneker Park. So it's really exciting. The development scenario in the plan literally transforms the land use in this area. We retain about 8 million square feet of federal office space, but there's the opportunity for another 1 million square feet of office space, whether that is federal or private. We're adding about 100,000 square feet of commercial services, the desperately needed 1.8 million square feet of residential or hotel. It establishes 1.2 million square feet of museum space. It creates 14.3 acres of new and improved parkland and reconnects the street grid, which we all know which is one of the biggest impediments in this area. So we can add about 17 new intersections. And then what's amazing is that in adding 4 million square feet of development, we actually are reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by 51% with all of our new district energy strategies that we want to employ in this area. We're capturing and reusing all of the rainwater. We're reducing our potable water use by 70%. And with good waste management practices, we think we can divert about 80% of the waste from the landfill. So during that public comment period, we see very strong support for the plan, in particular for development over the freeway, the restoration of the L'Enfant Grid and Maryland Avenue, removal of the Forrestal building over 10th Street, pedestrian and bicycle improvements, and enhanced open spaces. And then we also received a lot of very technical comments on the energy and water strategies, which are great and will be very informative in terms of some of the follow-up work that we're doing. We also heard some issues and concerns. Those included a concern over the solar panels over the freeway, and our plan now addresses this issue by we've added better images of how this might actually look with more landscaping, more buffering, and we also acknowledge that this is definitely something that needs to be studied further for it to move forward. The U.S. Postal Service expressed concern about how we depicted the future of their headquarters building. We called for repurposing it in the plan. That's basically privatizing it and changing its use at some point. And so we have addressed their concern with new language, saying that if they ever decide to vacate this site, that then we would like to see it repurposed. We also addressed their concerns about adding retail and kiosks down on 10th Street. They were concerned about the impact on their lobby, and so that has been addressed in the plan as well. We were asked to add a security discussion, and we've done that in Chapter 2 on page 12, talked about what that means for different types of buildings and setbacks and so forth. We were also asked to discuss the need for flexibility and implementation, the acknowledged costs and limited funds, especially a lack of congressional funds at this time, and the need for an implementation strategy. And we have done all of that in both the introduction and also in Chapter 5, which now has a section on implementation. We spent a lot of time working on Chapter 5, and we still have work to do in terms of follow-up studies, but basically this sort of highlights what Chapter 5 talks about now, and a lot of it is the pre-development studies and work that need to happen prior to getting to any sort of development designs. And while this looks a little bit overwhelming because this area is very complex and a lot needs to happen, I do want to say that just in this phase 1, 9 of these 12 items are already underway and should be done actually as soon as this fall. In fact, a lot of them would be done in time to actually inform an RFP process if GSA were to pursue that route following the RFI. So it does look like a lot, but as I mentioned before, all different agencies are taking this very seriously and moving pretty quickly, and I'll talk about some of these now in a little bit more detail. So what NCPC is doing with the task force and especially in coordination with DC and GSA and the National Park Service, we are looking at, we have an economic analysis underway. This is working with GSA on really doing a cost-benefit analysis for the area bound by the Federal Triangle South boundary and looking at the costs and benefits of doing the development scenario that we've prepared in this plan and disaggregating it by federal stakeholder, the city, private sector, and so forth. We're working on an implementation program. We're very fortunate to have Diane Stoltz on detail from GSA here, and she's helping us set up an actual implementation program for all of these things, looking at the critical paths. We start to do that in this plan, but we all know that it could, we can go much further, and it can be a lot more detailed than what it is, and so that's underway right now. We're working on a stormwater infrastructure study, which looks at the technical and feasibility study, basically, of the district water system. That's going to be very important for informing actually the last thing here, which we started a couple weeks ago with our project partners, and that's the interim design, streetscape design for 10th Street and the Banneker connection, which is a very exciting project. Just briefly, it is going to be establishing a cross-section dimension for 10th Street, very important for informing any future RFP that GSA might put out for this area, because obviously that impacts the development parcels. Preparing conceptual designs and identifying programmatic opportunities for Phase 1 streetscape improvements, so we're working closely with DDOT on that. And then finally, developing a conceptual design for the temporary pedestrian connection from Banneker Overlook down to Main Avenue, which is also very exciting, and will be a big improvement from the GO path that exists there today. So if you were to look at all of these studies, just to let you know, I mean, this is our timeline. They are happening very quickly, and we will probably be back here, as I mentioned, in May with an update to you. We'll be meeting with the task force a few times between now and then, but these are moving very quickly, which is very exciting. So you'll get to see us again. And then the last thing I want to touch on is we've had extensive conversations with the with the task force about implementation, and we've considered, we've considered various implementation models, including a redevelopment agency, which might provide the easiest vehicle for coordination in the long run, but also is very political, very expensive to start up. And I think that the decision of the task force is that, given everything underway right now, that it might be best to actually wait and assess right now where we're headed with all of these other implementation vehicles prior to deciding whether we need to take a more aggressive step, such as pursuing some sort of a redevelopment agency for this area. Those, just as a reminder, I mean, we have the Southwest Eco District Task Force itself that will continue to meet over the next year and guide the work of the respective agencies in this area. There's the Emerging Business Improvement District, GSA, and NCPC are working very closely with the property owners who are thinking about starting this improvement district. And again, I can't reiterate, they're excited to sort of expand their responsibilities to help, and help implement some of the eco district recommendations. We have what's happening with GSA. I mean, it's a very powerful tool that possibly that they are considering an RFP for 22 acres of this land, which sit wholly within the eco district itself. We are working closely with DCOP on the zoning rewrite and looking at how any potential zoning could impact, if the federal government were to ultimately dispose of land in this area, what sort of zoning could help achieve some of the things that we want to see here. And then lastly, NCPC is going to be holding a peer review through the National Academies of Sciences to really look specifically at the implementation of district energy and water systems. And so it's our recommendation, both the task force and staff, that we actually sort of stay the course with all of these implementation vehicles and sort of reassess where we are 6 months from now when we have a little bit more information, especially regarding what GSA is doing. So with that, I'm going to conclude my presentation, is the Executive Director's recommendation that the Commission accept the Southwest Eco District Plan and direct staff to use the plan to advise applicants to use the plan as a guide when programming, planning, and designing future development proposals in the study area. Evaluate and make recommendations for development proposals in the study area that go beyond the routine maintenance of public buildings. And so actually what we mean by this is not minor alterations to buildings, minor modernization projects. This is much bigger, these are much bigger projects that we're talking about, and proposals for improvements to parks, public spaces, and public transportation systems, to guide input on federal land and private planning studies and reports, prepared for properties in the study area, to inform future updates of NCPC strategic plan, and to develop or amend future NCPC planning studies and reports, including the comprehensive plan and the Federal Capital Improvements Program. And so with that, I conclude my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Sullivan. Are there questions for Ms. Sullivan or discussion among ourselves? Ms. White.
I don't have a question, but I have a couple of comments, and I just want to commend the staff and the task force. I think the plan itself will serve as a model for the rest of the country and what you've put together, and I'm particularly impressed with how far along the thinking is on implementation strategies. And the notion of a peer review, I think, is really just outstanding. So my compliments.
Thank you.
Mr. Wells.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I wrote a statement so that I would remember everything. But speaking not just as the council representative, but also as the council member who represents Ward 6, home of the Southwest Eco District, I want to thank the NCPC staff, the Southwest Eco District Task Force, Chairman Bryant, for your task force leadership, and of course, all the community members who contributed to the vision for a more sustainable Southwest DC. This will give us a roadmap for transforming an inefficient and disjointed federal office precinct with 60,000 jobs and 0 residents into a sort of mixed-use, vibrant, and sustainable neighborhoods we've been striving to build throughout our city. Remarkable things are happening at our Southwest waterfront, the wharf development in particular. As DC rediscovers its waterfront, I cannot overstate the importance of converting this federal office quadrant from the barrier that it is today to a rich and diverse neighborhood, linking and connecting our waterfront with our central business and tourist destinations. When I chaired the committee with legislative oversight for the DC Office of Planning, I shepherded the Maryland Avenue Southwest Plan through council approvals. This plan presented a vision for making Maryland Avenue into the great urban boulevard envisioned in the L'Enfant Plan. It also made the case for a major multimodal transportation hub in the heart of the study area. Pleased to see how that plan and Southwest Eco District integrate, hopefully a new standard for coordinating planning between DC and our federal partners. Since the passage of that plan, I've been pushing our mayor and Department of Transportation to move swiftly through necessary technical analysis so that we can be full partners with GSA, who is thankfully moving at equally enthusiastic pace. I expect us to remain active in the effort and ensure that the federal investments in this are in keeping with the policies, principles, and visions spelled out in the plan. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Wells, very much. Other comments? Mr. Provincia?
I'd like to echo the words of some of the other commissioners. Many positive aspects, the strategies for the planning in the neighborhoods, transportation, energy, water, waste, and so forth, the transparency, the number of presentations in public forums, communication, collaboration, 17 different partners, the tremendous investment to revitalize this area, I think is exceptional. The EDR report uses language that describes this as a isolated federal precinct. There's very little retail on the ground floors, very few trees in this area, and this scope of this project would address many of those. I think the areas where there might be room for improvement to take a good plan and make it a great and world-class national standard plan might be in the areas of implementation, housing, street design, treatment of water, utilities, air quality, mass transit. I'd like to also address the LEED certification objectives as well as operations and maintenance in that order. I think, as I understand the plan, it would almost double the population there to something like 50,000. The area I think where it falls short is I just tried to do a quick ratio: 1.8 million square feet of new residential and hotel, 1,500 residents and 240,000. That's about visitors. That's about a 160 to 1 ratio. So the concern is we could to continue to promote the folks that transit the area as opposed to the folks that live and reside and love and care for and respect the neighborhood. I think it only talks about 1,250 to 1,500 residents, which would be only about 1 or 2% of the total population working out of the building or out of the district. So housing would be of one concern. Another would be the Southwest Freeway that bisects a portion of the district is clearly a source of a lot of bad things, noise, pollution, exhaust, and so forth. So while there was discussion about using selling the air rights, perhaps as opposed to only solar panels, some kind of a green park, a green space might be another alternative. A vegetated kind of a lid, if you will, over that space could be considered. That might even be able to connect to, create, and expand the existing Banneker Park that is immediately adjacent. There's also some language in the plan about facilitate transiting, transversing the city. In our experience, that's not necessarily a positive thing and runs counter to sustainability principles when you just have folks that pass through. They jeopardize the flow of pedestrians, and as we further promote and facilitate access between the waterfront and the mall, the number of pedestrians using the area, and then we had which generates the conflicts between pedestrians as well as motorized vehicles, I think is a challenge. There's some concerns about the photovoltaics. I think on the surface sounds like a good idea, but again, with the vehicles passing immediately underneath, photovoltaics also need love and care and maintenance and repair, and can easily be their efficiency and capacity is easily diminished if they're not frequently cleaned. Accessing suspended photovoltaics over a very active highway might be a bit of a safety challenge. In the area of water, there's a good discussion in the plan about the use of non-potable water, and it talks about the use being relatively unchanged from today, but that's hard to reconcile with the addition of either a small contingent of permanent residents as well as a huge increase in the number of visitors, as well as the folks going up to something like 50,000 that would work there. So it's just a little difficult to reconcile those two. There's also costs that are related to building and maintaining the stormwater treatment system. Well, it's admirable to put cisterns and water collection devices underground. Then you have energy-consuming pumps to pump that low-cost stored water up to where it can be points of use. Air quality. The plan talks about reconnecting the street grid and creating 16 new intersections for easy accessibility. Again, if we continue to funnel the pedestrian traffic on the surface as opposed to one of the models that I've seen effectively used in Europe is directing pedestrians underground. So they stay off of the service intersections, and then they make these underground areas not just poorly lit tunnels, but they also they put in snack bars and coffee shops and so forth to attract people to not only transit that area, but also to stay and enjoy it. There's some language in there about employing parking management strategies to maximize convenient car parking and encourage alternate forms of transportation. That seems to be on the surface a bit of a contradiction, perhaps even an oxymoron. If you facilitate car parking, it seems to encourage more driving as opposed to encouraging folks to get into the mass transit system. Power. It talks about a government-generated power sharing agreement to use the existing plant, which is aging, and in our experience, the uptime, the reliability, the enhanced use leasing arrangements, things like negotiating rates. We've seen challenges here in our local private utility providers when we have major outages and how quickly they can restore the grids. There's some reference in about green walls. In our experience, green walls are commendable. The plan says they decrease energy costs. I think what they actually do is decrease cooling demand, which could, but not necessarily guarantee, lower energy bills. Permeable surfaces don't always, in our experience, improve water quality. What they do, though, is help reduce stormwater runoff and improve groundwater quality. On the LEED Platinum, well, that's highly commendable. It's in Department of Defense, we've actually, the standard is silver, and we are prohibited from going above silver without a special exemption from that, a waiver. And we have only exercised that in a couple of cases where we wanted to do demonstrations projects. So I'm not sure that anything above silver is a good addition, particularly for the federal buildings, of taxpayer dollars. And I think that's about it on our comments. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Provencio, very much. Mr. Agoni.
Thank you. I just wanted to commend the staff, the task force, everyone who participated in the preparation of the Southwest Eco District Plan, and I would just acknowledge that very exemplary coordination extends even to the preparation of a press release, which I think the commission would actually, commission members might like to get a copy of, because it's a nice synopsis of the plan, and it makes reference to some of the other related planning efforts. And we'll be waiting for our Ask Me About the Southwest Eco District button that we can wear around town and tell people about this planning process. I would also just ask, we're fortunate that our commission is actually composed of members who can actually do things to help implement this plan, and I'm looking at you, Mina, and at our colleague Peter May at the National Park Service, and of course the folks that represent the district. And so I hope this exemplary coordination continues through the implementation phase. And there are lots of opportunities coming up, more even than have been mentioned so far, including opportunities to address tour buses, an issue for both the Park Service and the district that might be coordinated with further actions within the Southwest Eco District. There's a new long-range transportation plan that the district is doing, and there are opportunities there. There'll be opportunities through even the master plan for Union Station and the proposed improvements in Amtrak service. So there continue to be lots of connections that I think can be in a nice way exploited to help make this plan a reality. So with that, I would like to move the EDR and congratulate the staff. Thank you.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there further discussion? Mr. May?
No, I just wanted to, I'm glad Mr. Agoni mentioned working together on some future projects, because there are some things that we can work on together, and I really am very excited about working on them. And I would also echo all the commendations for the staff, and I'd say the task force, but I was part of the task force.
That's all right.
I won't say that. But the staff did a great job, and I appreciate that. And we I think sometimes put them through the ringer as we went through this, but I think this whole thing grew and nicely into something really substantial, whereas it started out as a fairly, relatively speaking, modest portion of framework plan, and it grew into something really big and exciting, and we look forward to working on implementing.
Ms. Wright, and then Mr. Hart.
I would really recommend that you contain your enthusiasm, Peter, just for starters. I want to thank also, because he's here, I also was on the task force, so I don't want to I'm really glad we had a big role in it, but Brett Banks is here from our staff for another reason, and he did the lion's share of the staff work for GSA. So thank you, Brett. And I'm not going to pile on and say the same stuff, but I think it's foundational to all kinds of possibilities. So to my previous comments about aspirational work, it doesn't get more aspirational than this.
That's true.
So I hope I live to see some of it done.
You will.
And Mr. Hart.
I think this is the best thing that's come out of the Capital Planning Commission in years. And I applaud the staff's effort, the task force involvement, and all of the open forums that were used to get this plan put forward. I would hesitate to wait 6 months to try and keep this on course. And I think that really, having been delivered the plan that is so ambitious and so complex, that it's really important to figure out how it's going to be implemented and to get somebody who will take it on as their prime mission. So my concern is that it not simply be parsed out, that stayed together under a single organization to implement. But congratulations to all who were involved. Thank you.
On the issue of implementation, that was a question that we had. As the planning phases draw to a close and we get into phase 2 and 3 and implementation from FY15 out, are the roles well defined as to who will have the lead or the partners in the leading the hard part, the implementation?
That's a question for...
Okay, I will answer that. We, again, as I said, we've talked a lot about this at the Southwest Eco District Task Force, and I think in light of the different governance entities that exist or are emerging, such as the Southwest Eco District Task Force, who I would say I think are taking on a more serious role in this upcoming year because of everything that is going on. The Business Improvement District, which hopefully will be up and running by the end of this year, and then in light of what GSA is doing. And I think we need to see how that plays out over the next couple of months before we make, at least this was our recommendation to the Southwest Eco District Task Force, that we wait a few months to see how that plays out before deciding that we need another entity on top of all of that. And plus the zoning and some of the other things that Mr. Groening mentioned.
I will just say that the problem is not that nothing is happening. The problem is so much is happening that to pick a leadership team now before it's clear who the leaders are going to be is the problem. So I absolutely respect your point on that, but I think we actually have kind of the opposite problem. It's a wealth of things happening.
I will note that the study area is 115 acres and give or take. And while the study area is dominated by government-owned buildings, there are a number of large private sector landowners in the area. And
26%.
The task force has not had, and it's been D.C. government and federal government representatives on the task force, but I say this to say it's not as though we've been making decisions and planning in a vacuum. We have reached out and had terrific dialogue in coordination with a lot of the private sector landowners to better understand their plans in the near term, medium term, and long term, so that they could better understand what we're trying to do, and to the extent possible to coordinate so that the public sector and the private sector, to the extent possible, are moving together and planning together. And so there are a lot of synergies that allowed that, and this was a perfect time to bring all of these forces together. So I did want to make the point that private sector landowners were very much a part of this discussion in putting together this plan.
One of the participants appears to be the CSX Railroad. Is there any concern about or any initiative to perhaps relocate some of their line? Multiple agencies have concerns about the proximity.
Yes, and that's a critical piece to this plan, and the whole Maryland Avenue redevelopment or visioning as what Maryland Avenue should have been historically has been very much a part of this, and integral to that are the CSX plans. So all of that has been very central to this discussion, these plans.
If I can just say another point about that. I don't want to leave the impression that the plan envisions relocating, i.e. out of the area of the CSX lines, but rather depressing the lines to allow bridging over the lines, bridging over the trains, and allowing additional passenger rail service in the same corridor. So as opposed to, as suggested in a previous NCPC plan, routing it around the city. I didn't want to...
That's a good point. What we're talking about is CSX is digging deeper and decking over, and we'll create another several blocks of buildable property.
That's correct.
So.
Step in the right direction, but again, doesn't completely address the standoff distances and security issues. We've seen Baltimore's a good example. Remember, they've had a couple of recent incidents that had major disruption when they had rail accidents.
Since seeing no further discussion, it's been moved and seconded. All in favor of accepting, all in favor of the EDR, which is to accept the plan, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Thank you very much. Ms. Sullivan, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Agenda item number 5B is the map and text amendment for the old post office, and we have Mr. Detman.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the Commission. I'll be presenting to you a referral from the Zoning Commission of the District of Columbia for a map amendment and related text amendment to establish zoning at a collection of 4 properties located in the Federal Triangle, most known as the old post office and Pavilion Annex. With regard to the location of the proposed zoning, you can see it located here in red in the Federal Triangle. And what you also see on this graphic here is the existing zoning map, primarily located to existing zoning located to the north of the Federal Triangle. What you can see on this diagram is that for the large federal installations that contain multiple buildings, there is no zoning over them. They're currently unzoned. However, in the downtown area, such as where the FBI building is and the Hotel Monaco, which is outlined in yellow here, it's not uncommon to see the individual federally owned properties located throughout the dense commercial areas of the city to actually have an existing zoning over the top of them, and that's not uncommon. Here's a closer look at the area that's proposed to be zoned from unzoned to the C4 zoning. It's outlined in red. Again, it encompasses 4 properties, which make up the site of the existing old post office building and the old post office building Pavilion Annex, which is kind of tucked in behind the IRS building. The site is generally bound by Pennsylvania Avenue on the north, 10th Street on the east, and 12th Street on the west, with the IRS forming the southern boundary. By way of background, in terms of some ongoing activity that gets us to the proposed zoning, back in 2008, Congress passed the Old Post Office Redevelopment Act, which essentially directed the administrator of GSA to proceed with redevelopment of the old post office building in accordance with existing authorities that are available to GSA for such projects. In March 2011, GSA issued a request for proposals for private redevelopment for the highest and best use of the property. And then in February of 2012, GSA selected Trump Old Post Office, LLC. In terms of ongoing activity, currently GSA and the Trump Organization are in lease negotiations which will result in a long-term public-private ground lease to redevelop the property as a luxury hotel and conference center with accessory eating establishments, retail, and some cultural uses. They're also in the midst of schematic design development for the property, as well as carrying out, as required under federal law, Section 106 consultation for compliance with the National Historic Preservation Act, and then also there's a draft NEPA environmental assessment that's out for public comment right now. The last point on this slide is that following the redevelopment of the property, the buildings as well as the property that the buildings reside on will remain federally owned and under the jurisdiction of the General Services Administration. I had mentioned that the Old Post Office Redevelopment Act directed the GSA administrator to proceed with redevelopment of the property using existing authorities. And I'll just list them here and describe them briefly. There are 2 existing authorities that GSA is mainly relying upon to carry out this project. One is 40 U.S.C. 581, which authorizes the administrator to lease a federal building under terms considered to be in the public interest, and specifically allows for the cooperative use of federal buildings through leaseholds with entities that are engaged in commercial, cultural, entertainment, educational, and recreational activities. Secondly, GSA is using Section 111 of the National Historic Preservation Act, which permits any federal agency to establish and implement alternatives for historic properties that are not needed for the agency's purposes, and may lease a historic property to any person or organization if it's determined by the head of that agency to be in the best interest and to adequately preserve that historic property. We have a very good precedent for this kind of project that's currently ongoing at the OPO. GSA back in the early 2000s utilized these same exact authorities to redevelop the Tariff Commission building, now being operated as the Hotel Monaco and Post Restaurant, located at 700 F Street Northwest. I'll note that for this project, as I noted earlier, there was an existing zoning over the top of this property even prior to GSA proceeding with this redevelopment project. It was a DDC4 zoning. Currently, it's operated by Kimpton Hotel, again, under the terms of a long-term ground lease with GSA. And GSA still considers this to meet the definition of a federal public building. This project was reviewed by NCPC in 1997 pursuant to its in lieu of zoning authority under the Planning Act. We reviewed it in 1997 and with 2 subsequent actions in 2000. Construction for this project was overseen by GSA in accordance with its own building and facility standards, which is called the P100 standards, which are essentially GSA's building codes for carrying out construction projects. And so in addition to the mechanical and the electrical and plumbing standards that you'd find in any local building code, the P100 standards also include a section on general requirements that incorporate federal law that requires federal agencies to carry out construction projects consistent with national codes, as well as consideration given to any kind of state and local codes that exist. And the site for that particular federal law is 40 U.S.C. 3312. And so moving forward from background and getting into the proposed map and text amendment, this is the plat that is associated with the proposed action that the Commission has taken. You can see outlined in red the site of the old post office building, a portion of 11th Street that was previously closed back in the 1920s, and then the existing pavilion annex, which is currently vacant. And so this area is going to actually be proposed to be zone DDC4, and the applicant for this proposed zoning is the DC Office of Planning. In terms of the DDC4 and what's envisioned, or what are the purposes of these 2 zones, the C4 is known as the Central Business District. And is a high-density commercial district that comprises of retail and office centers, and it also allows for other uses. It's intended to support a variety of uses, one of them being hotels as a matter of right. On top of the base C4 zoning, what's being proposed is the DD, or the Downtown Development Overlay District, and that's applied to areas that are known as the shopping district or the retail core. And the overlay seeks to create a balance of uses, again, including hotels, but also gives consideration for the preservation of historic resources while allowing some sensitive and compatible development. Collectively, the DDC4 zoning designation would allow for a maximum building height of 130 feet, maximum FAR of 8.5, and a maximum lot occupancy of 100%. And so, as you can see, the intended program, the luxury hotel and conference center with the accessory retail and cultural uses, it is very much consistent with what would be allowed under the DDC4 zoning, and which is why staff has forwarded a favorable recommendation to the Commission with one condition. That one condition pertains to the text amendment, which is shown here. I won't read it in full. The text that you're seeing here is the existing definition of the Downtown Development Overlay Zone. It essentially describes the boundaries or the areas that possess the DD overlay. And the proposed text amendment is underlined there. Essentially, what the proposed text amendment is intended to do is incorporate these 4 properties into the definition of the DD overlay. I will say that during the Zoning Commission hearing, this proposed language did cause a little bit of confusion, and the Zoning Commission has asked DCOP to go back and look at clarifying this language, but staff included it in its analysis to provide one point of clarification. In the text amendment, there's a phrase that basically says that it's incorporating these 4 properties, which were properties that were previously under federal control. As I've noted, even following the redevelopment project, these properties will remain under federal control, under federal ownership, under the jurisdiction of GSA. And so we incorporated this language knowing that it may change a little bit before it goes for final action by the Zoning Commission, just to clarify the point that these properties will remain under federal control. With regard to the basis of the DCOP's zoning application, in its final report to the Zoning Commission, there's a statement that says, and I'll just read it, quote it exactly the way it's written, because the property will no longer be used for a federal public building or use and will shift to a private business, the property is subject to zoning. And then the report relies upon these 3 existing provisions in the zoning regs to justify why there is a need for a zoning on top of this property. The first one essentially is the provision that exempts federally owned buildings as well as district-owned buildings from the zoning code. The second one talks about that a building permit or a certificate of occupancy can't be issued for properties under private ownership prior to a zoning designation being applied to that property. And then the third one pertains to, again, the issuance of building permits, and that a building permit can't be issued until zoning is applied. With regard to the first provision, 106.4, GSA has informed staff by way of a letter to the executive director, which I believe was provided to you prior to today's hearing, that while the Trump Organization will operate the hotel and conference facility, the OPO will still fall within the definition of a federal public building. Further, with regard to section or provision 106.7, as I've already stated, even following the redevelopment of the project, these properties will remain federally owned under federal jurisdiction, and they will not revert into private ownership. And so with those 2 points in mind, and as stated in their letter, GSA's position is that the OPO redevelopment project is not subject to local zoning, but rather is subject to NCPC's in lieu of zoning authority pursuant to the Section 8722 of the Planning Act. Staff agrees with GSA on this particular point, again noting that this is the same exact process that was used in the Hotel Monaco project with which NCPC reviewed under that same authority. I wanted to just talk very briefly about the federal regulations that discuss the need for federal construction projects to be carried out in conformance with national codes and give consideration to local codes, and that's 40 U.S.C. 3312 again. So again, similar to the Hotel Monaco project, GSA is going to be overseeing the construction of the OPO redevelopment project in accordance with its own P100 facility standards, which incorporates the federal requirements under this law. So therefore, despite the position being that this property is not subject to local zoning regulations in the permitting process, federal law does require GSA to undertake this project to the maximum extent technically feasible in compliance with one of the nationally recognized model building codes and any applicable national codes as well. And in addition, the law requires that prior to undertaking any kind of building project, agencies must first consider all state and local codes, not including procedural requirements that would apply to the building if it were being carried out, or if the construction was being carried out by an entity other than a federal agency. The law does define a very clear consultation process where agencies are required to consult with the appropriate state and local agencies and first give due consideration to any recommendations that are provided by those state and local agencies prior to undertaking the project. And so thus far, we're well on our way with consultation on this project through the 106 process. And so thus far, GSA has been coordinating very, very closely with several District of Columbia agencies, including DCRA, and through independent consultation, and again through the NEPA and Section 106 consultation, GSA has indicated that they will continue that close coordination. And so with that, it's the Executive Director's recommendation to advise the Zoning Commission that the proposed map and text amendment will not adversely affect the federal interest, on the condition that the proposed text amendment be modified to limit the statement properties which previously were under federal control, as these properties will remain under federal control. To note that while GSA intends to redevelop the OPO and Pavilion Annex under the terms of a public-private partnership with the Trump Organization, the OPO and the Pavilion Annex, including the property upon which these structures reside, will remain under federal control, federally owned under the jurisdiction of GSA, and therefore are not subject to DC zoning regulations, but rather are subject to NCPC's in lieu of zoning authority. And then finally, to note that GSA will undertake all building permitting and inspections during the OPO redevelopment project, and will carry out the project in a manner that is consistent with local land use policies and zoning and building codes to the maximum extent technically feasible, in accordance with federal law and the policies of the federal elements of the comprehensive plan. That concludes my presentation, Mr. Chairman, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Any questions from Mr. Dettner? Mr. May.
One simple question. What's the term of the ground lease that's being proposed right now?
I believe it's 60 or 65. I think it's 60.
60. 60 years.
And how does that compare to Monaco?
Monaco, I believe, is a longer term than that, but I can refer to Brett Banks or Commissioner Wright.
60?
It's 60.
Yep. Okay. I'm just curious about that comparison.
Mr. Gunn?
Thank you. You know, I think this is another matter where we might agree to disagree. As you pointed out, as we put out in the presentation, that there was underlying zoning at the Hotel Monaco. So we didn't have to take an action to apply zoning to that site. That would be true for the FBI. It has underlying zoning. This is a site that does not have any underlying zoning designation. And we, you know, it's our position in the district that it does need zoning. I will also clarify, I think Shane made reference to it, that we have withdrawn, in fact, the text amendment. The map amendment continues, but we have withdrawn the text amendment. That happened last week. You know, I don't know how it necessarily even serves the commission to try to highlight the differences that exist at this point in time. This is something for the lawyers of the agencies to kind of work out. I have some proposed amendments. We haven't moved the executive director's recommendation, but at such time, I think I would have some amendments to propose that essentially are silent about this jurisdictional issue, because it really is going to be a matter that the GSA and the District of Columbia decide in terms of whether or not they want to seek or have local zoning applied to this site, or whether they want to try to obtain building permits, liquor licenses, and other things without the benefit of zoning, which is a typical prerequisite.
Well, while you have the floor, let's pause and see, is there a motion on this EDR? It's been moved and seconded, so it's properly before us.
So what I would move is a motion that that advises the Zoning Commission of the District of Columbia, and I would remove that the beginning of the second line, and related text amendment, since the text amendment is no longer, you could leave it in if you wanted to, because it got submitted to you, but it's not, it's been withdrawn from the Zoning Commission consideration. And then put a period after federal interest in the third line. And then in the second paragraph, will remain federally owned and under federal jurisdiction, period. And then nothing else to be said there. And I'm okay with leaving the rest of it as it is.
I would second that, Mr. Chairman, and
it doesn't take away any rights that people have. It doesn't say whether or not one thing is going to prevail over the other. It becomes factual, and, you know, we can let the lawyers duke it out.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Before we vote on it, however, let's make sure council has it. Okay. Yeah, but can we, just so everybody has it in front of them, can you read it back to us, council? Or Mr. Gunning? We're on page 2 of the EDR under recommendations.
Advises the Zoning Commission of the District of Columbia that the proposed map amendment to establish zoning at Square 323, Lot 800, and parcels 1, 2, and 3 of Squares 349 and 350 will not adversely affect the federal interest, period. Then to the next.
So hold on. So what you did there is you eliminated "and related text amendment."
Yes.
As you read it, please note where the amendment is.
And related text amendment in the second line is removed.
Okay.
Oh, okay. And then in the third line, after the word federal interest, there's a period, and the rest comes out. Then
So the rest
of the sentence, on the condition that the project to the end of that
is
period.
stricken. Okay.
The last sentence, project. Then
Okay.
in the next paragraph, 1, 2, 3, line 4 will remain federally owned and under federal jurisdiction, period.
That's stricken?
No, that
That
remains.
stays
Oh, that one.
in.
Okay.
And then the rest comes out.
Then everything else is stricken?
Yes.
Okay.
Then that last paragraph remains.
So a period after jurisdiction and the remainder is stricken. Okay. Council, you need a moment to review?
The only thing that troubles me is you're taking out the reference to subject to NCPC's in lieu of zoning authority, because that's clearly been established between GSA and NCPC.
It doesn't make it not subject to not reference it, but I think it's something that we have not resolved between the city and GSA. I don't know why it would need to be stated as if it had been resolved in this document.
But retaining it has the benefit of clarifying why this action is not subject to DC zoning. I think it has some benefit.
It's debatable,
for
is what we're
retaining it.
saying.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with Mr. Goning that what we're striking out here just bears, peels it back to what is factual and necessary to say on behalf of this commission. It does not go into why do we want to weigh in on the issue of, who has jurisdiction over what between GSA and DC? It either is a public building and public use, or it's not. And the rules therefore apply. So if it remains federal building and use, then all of the normal authorities remain. NCPC still has authority.
But again, retaining it explains why it ends up here for.
I just don't see the point of it. It's not. Nothing gets taken away.
But nothing is taken away by leaving it in either. It's a declarative sentence that can.
Exactly.
I mean, it's an if-then proposition, right? If it's federally owned, then the in lieu of, et cetera, applies.
But our rules say you can't issue a certificate of occupancy. You can't get certain other licenses without local zoning. You don't need a liquor license at GSA, but the hotel might need a liquor license, for example. I'm just saying that you might find it convenient to have local zoning at the site, even if you don't have to.
I have a question, though. How did Fitch, Fox, and Brown, for example, or any of the retailers that have previously occupied the building get a license?
I'd have to look back at that and see.
Shane can answer.
I mean, I'm just asking.
Right. I mean, it hasn't come up.
How does that work? Brett, do you know the answer to any of this?
I don't.
Shane does.
Shane?
I can tell you what I know through a recent conversation I had last week with the zoning administrator when it came to issuance of business licenses on unzoned property. The short answer is that the zoning administrator said it's kind of a murky process. And then he gave me an example, because I said, well, what about the Reagan Building? What about Hotel Monaco? With Hotel Monaco, it has an existing zoning. And so when someone someone submits an application for a basic business license, the first question that they're asked is, can you demonstrate land use approval through display of a certificate of occupancy? In that case, they will go over to the zoning administrator's office if there's no C of O, such as an unzoned property or federally owned property, and essentially the zoning division of DCRA will issue a certificate of occupancy for purposes of being able to issue that building or that business license. But we're told by GSA when it comes to construction and building permits and final construction approvals, that's handled by GSA through its own P100 process.
Okay, so since we probably don't want to debate this here, right? Because we're not the deciders in the end, likely. So on the amendment, it seems 6 of one, half dozen the other to me. I mean, I don't know that it makes a cardinal change in the EDR for it to stay or go. But I'm not a lawyer, so.
The question before us is the amendment.
Right.
Mr. Miller, did you have? I'm sorry, we finished, Ms. Right? You were finished?
I'm finished,
I'm
yeah.
sorry, I didn't mean to. Mr. Miller?
No, since I was the seconder of the Mr. Groning's amendment, I just wanted to formally say I associate myself with all of her remarks and also with Mr. May's remarks. I think the commenting on the zoning map amendment, the way it would be proposed with this amendment, I believe, if I recall correctly, would be identical to the comments that this commission made when the Southeast Federal Center was zoned. I believe that's the case. Without getting into authorities, it just was commenting on the map amendment, whether it's consistent or not consistent with the federal interest.
And I'll say again that the intention is not to take away anyone's arguments, absolutely not, or to undermine anyone's arguments, but simply not to have them in this document and when we can't come to a conclusion that we'd all agree upon.
Is there further discussion? Sorry?
What is legal counsel?
Yeah, I'm just gonna ask.
Ms. Schuyler, do you have council guidance?
I don't want to have to fight down the road about NCPC's authority, but since this is GSA's issue, if GSA seems to be of the position that in or out, I would defer to GSA.
And I'm, because it's, sorry, because it doesn't seem, to me, to the untrained eye, that it makes a cardinal difference. I think I'm more comfortable keeping the language in for our purposes, because I don't think it weakens the possibility of a debate, which we can have, but it doesn't seem material to me. So, I mean, the issue is, I think the issue will become, does the old post office as redeveloped and with a ground lease of 60 years constitute the continuance of a federal building as defined? I think that's what the issue is ultimately. I don't think we're going to solve it here. I don't think the amendment changes the framework for the debate one way or another. So I think I'm going to support the EDR as written.
So procedurally, would we have to submit then another amendment, not a hostile,
Well, we vote on this one.
but not a friendly, but perhaps a cordial amendment to retain the language?
Cordial, yeah. I'll tip my hand and say I'm going to vote for the EDR as it's written, but I'm not going to get in a big wad if we lose.
Thank you for that clarification.
Mr. May.
So we vote on the amendment?
We're trying to. Mr. May.
I just wanted to suggest to Mr. Groening a possible alternative,
Right.
which would be, rather than simply striking everything after the words federally owned and under federal jurisdiction, say that it will remain federally owned and under federal jurisdiction and therefore subject to NCPC's in lieu of zoning authority, blah, 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 blah. I don't know if that is satisfactory to you, but it does restate that since it's a federal building, it'll still be under NCPC's authority, but it does not cut out the word that it's not subject to zoning regulations, because in some ways it may still be debatable, as you say.
I did consider that. I just think if it's subject to NCPC's in lieu of zoning regulations, whether we say it or not, it's subject to it, and this whole document discusses fully the debate. So this is really kind of a distillation of a recommendation. All the discussion remains in the document. So
So the question is, if it's implicit, it's tacitly understood to follow. If this, then that. So why does the amended language make the district feel like it's in a better position?
owned and under federal jurisdiction doesn't exactly track with the language that's in the district law about what kind of things require zoning. That's why. Federally owned and under federal jurisdiction relates to where NCPC's in lieu of, but it doesn't perfectly track with what our city law says. So it's debatable, and we've debated it in every other instance where there's been this kind of a transfer. So, you know, including discussions with, remember we had armed forces. That was another recent case. I'm just saying, we've never solved it yet. We're not solving it now. Got it. We debated on every case.
Ms. White.
I would say, just listening to the discussion, it seems then we should just leave it in. I mean, if it is implicit, why not?
I'm saying it's not
state it?
implicit.
But if that is our position as an agency, why not leave it in? I guess I'm thinking along the lines of what Peter suggested.
You know, I'm making the case as, you know, as best as I can, that sometimes we have provisions that are in conflict. When we mention one that may apply and we neglect to mention the other, it makes it seem like we believe that there's only one way to resolve this issue. And I think that ambiguity, you know, isn't presented, but we don't have to go there. We're not taking away anyone's responsibilities, anyone's legal options, anyone's arguments, just by stating it factually.
Mr. Acosta, did you have
This is a
something?
point of clarification for the commission. With respect to the EDR itself and kind of the commission action, what we're going to send to the zoning commission is actually everything, the bullet points that you are going to consider. The actual discussion is actually just a staff report that does not necessarily weigh in as part of the zoning commission's deliberations. It's just as background information. You don't have to accept our findings or not, but everything, what you're going to vote on is literally what is going to be sent to the zoning commission, and that's your position as a commission.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Dixon.
It's like deja vu. These things just keep coming back, don't they? And it's not, but the problem we have here, and I'm obviously speaking as a representative of a city person, if we're silent, the issue is going to come up probably anyhow. It always does. If we put it even in the dictum, as they would call it in the law, the language after the finding, it gives weight to it. It says in some ways that the commission may be thinking about this. And by having it there, we suggest that. By not having it, we allow the parties to have the historical discussions they've been having for years. And that's what they're going to do, and that's fine. But by putting it here, we lend weight. And it may not be the bullets, but if it does become part of our record, folks can cite it possibly. And that's what we don't want to. This commission has no position on this. It's a DC versus a federal kind of a discussion that goes on for the last as years as I've been around. So it's going to happen again, whether we have it in here or not. But putting it here gives it more weight, even if it is just the dictum or the background language in the document. And therefore, I would support us taking it out, which is what we're asking for.
The question before us is Mr. Gunning's amendment, which is to strike certain lines, and I think we can take all these lines in a block. I'm sorry, Mr. May, did you have something?
Yeah. First of all, I wanted to clarify, although all this information gets transmitted to the Zoning Commission more or less is looking for a yes or no, is there a federal interest that's affected? And here it says no, and so the commission will act accordingly. So what is in the report, whether it's in their report or not, is really doesn't bear on their decision making. I was going to just offer up in one more attempt to try to find common ground here for all of us, and this may not be a worthwhile thing to pursue, but I'll throw it out there anyway. What if we just strike the entire second paragraph and be silent on the subject of who owns what and so on? I mean, what are we gaining by even having that language in there? As it was stated before, there's a robust discussion in the EDR of the entire issue. So if we just strike that middle paragraph entirely.
That's okay with me, too.
The issue of the robust discussion in the EDR, I think, is another argument to retain the language as drafted by the staff. It's the practice, I think, of the EDR to provide an executive summary of the detailed discussion. So that's our precedent. It would be inconsistent not to. Unless it was factually in error.
Chairman, a second. Mr. Dixon.
I would like to be dismissed. The language, we keep talking about having it in, not having it in, and then we say it's never going to be looked at. So we're talking about having it in, not having it in. The reason we don't want to have it in is because it will be looked at. Someone may not use it to make their decision, yes or no, but someone can cite the language as supportive of a position, which is controversial. So it's impossible to argue that it doesn't matter and then say, well, we should have it in. I mean, does that make sense? It doesn't matter, but yet we need to have it in. I don't think we need to have it in because it doesn't matter. It's not ours to decide.
Well, I hope we're inching toward a vote, Mr. Acosta.
Perhaps another point of clarification. The question at hand is really, is there a federal interest issue with respect to the zoning matter? It seems to me that the core issue here is that the debate is about a piece of federal land. And as it's determined by GSA in their letter to me and also my conversations with the acting administrators, that they have taken the position that this is federal property and a federal building. So if you want to make it clear that that's a federal interest issue, I do think you need to, that's each commission member could vote as they wish, but if that's the central matter at hand, and whether whether GSA can ultimately be compelled to submit as a federal government agency to be reviewed as a zoning case is really kind of the question. GSA is saying they're not subject to that because of a number of issues, including federal sovereignty. So I think that's the way you should think about this. I know each member has a different point of view, but I think the question here is, the kernel of truth here is whether a piece of federal property is subject to local control. And that's kind of the key. And if that's the position the commission is going to take on this.
I would not favor the removal of the second paragraph because it is about, it is another declarative statement about the future use of the building. So to remove it, I don't believe is in GSA's best interest, or the federal interest rather, because it is an indicator of our intent and the intent of our lessor, which is, there's no reason from our point of view to leave it out.
So as the maker of the amendment and the motion, I would say I'm happy to leave the declarative stuff in. I will just say we had a text amendment that we've withdrawn. The issue that gave rise to this recommendation and this discussion was the language, which is erroneous on our part, that says properties which were previously under federal control. So in a sense, that issue is mooted. We wouldn't have had this discussion but for that language, and then it would have been this thing. And the text has been withdrawn. So again, I suggest we just vote on the amendment. If it goes down, then we'll talk about what else we can do.
Okay.
Okay?
I think we all,
One other question, please, sir.
we really need to bring this to an end.
Question on a different subject. I think Mr. Detman's presentation talked about the...
Well, is your
application of
question on the
HIDAC.
amendment that's before us?
Well, it would influence my vote on the outcome of the proposal about the amendment. So it's on the application of the height. Does the application of the 130-foot limit apply to all of these parcels? They could be redeveloped to that height, or is just the tower of the post office as currently wavered? One of the few buildings that wavered. Remember our discussion Tuesday at the HIDAC meeting?
Now, are you asking that a future redevelopment of that site?
Right. Does the HIDAC as applied to this federal property allow the Trump organization to develop all of the parcels to 130 feet? Or will they have to maintain the current?
I would say any piece of the property that they
limitations?
intend new construction, depending upon if you're going to apply the HIDAC, depending upon where you're going to measure from, then yes.
All right. Good.
Under the HIDAC, that's correct.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
There's another legal issue.
Mr. Wells gets the final question.
I need to hear the amendment again.
Please.
If you look at as I understand it, if you look at the first paragraph, second line, that which has been stricken of the first four words, and related text amendment is gone. In the third line, a period is placed after federal interest period. And the rest of lines 3, all of 4, 5, and 6 are stricken. In the second paragraph, fourth line, a period is placed after federal jurisdiction. And the rest of lines 4, all of lines 5, 6, and 7 are stricken.
Did you say that the text...
The third paragraph remains intact.
Stricken or corrected?
Withdrawn. Seems reasonable.
The matters before us, we'll take all of those various amendments in a block. All in favor of Ms. Tregoning's amendment to strike the language noted, say aye.
Aye.
Raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 yeses for the amendment. All opposed to the amendment, raise your hand or say aye. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it fails on a vote of 5 to 6. So now we have before us the EDR as presented. Sensing no further discussion, Mr. May.
Mr. Chairman, I would suggest that we consider just making the first set of amendments, first paragraph, right? 'Cause
If
we
that's a
voted
motion, I'll
on-
second it. If that's a motion, I'll second it.
Yeah, so I would move that we keep Mr. Goning's, or sorry, we vote the EDR and keep Mr. Goning's edits to the first paragraph, since the related text amendment is no longer part of what the zoning commission is considering.
So paragraphs, the second paragraph remains intact.
I didn't sense that there was a great interest in further tweaking that, as I had suggested earlier.
I prefer your tweak to just letting it stand.
Okay, so I'd make that motion as well.
Second.
What motion?
So, let me,
Amending the first paragraph?
amend the first paragraph as Mr. Goning suggested.
Yeah.
And then where it says, "will remain federally owned and under federal jurisdiction," substituting, "and therefore remain," just those words, "and therefore remain," and skip to "subject to NCPC's in lieu of zoning authority pursuant to the National Capital Planning Act."
So you're striking are not subject to the District of Columbia zoning
That's right.
regulations.
Striking out "are not subject to the District of Columbia's zoning regulations," but rather
In what
are.
paragraph?
Second paragraph.
So you are
So,
messing with the second paragraph?
well, we had some discussion of it as the motion was being made, so shall I restate it?
Please.
Yes,
Okay.
please.
So I don't need to restate the first paragraph, right? We all understand what that said? So in the second paragraph, it would state, "notes that while the U.S. General Services Administration intends to redevelop the old post office pavilion, office and pavilion annex under the terms of a public-private partnership with the Trump Organization, the old post office and pavilion annex, including the property upon which these structures reside, will remain federally owned and under federal jurisdiction, and therefore remain subject to NCPC's in lieu of zoning authority and the National Capital Planning Act," and a whole bunch of citations, to period. So the words that are struck from the second paragraph begin at "are not subject to" and end at "but rather are." Got it? I'll state the words that are being crossed out. "Are not subject to the District of Columbia zoning regulations, but rather are." So that's my motion.
Second. If
It's
it
been-
hasn't already been done.
It's been moved and seconded. Council, do you have opinion on that, or do we continue to defer to GSA's opinion?
We would prefer to have the second paragraph untouched, but can support the omission from the first paragraph regarding the text amendment.
But you'll vote on this one and then see what happens.
But, so.
Or we could sever them.
Well, whatever. We'll go for the first paragraph surgery, not the second.
You want to make a friendly amendment to sever the amendments?
So moved.
First and second?
Accepted.
All right.
It's a friendly amendment.
The vote then before us are on the amendments to paragraph 1. Understood?
Right.
All in favor of the amendments to paragraph 1, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no? Passed. Second, amendments to paragraph 2, as Mr. May has stated. Any further discussion? All in favor of amendments to paragraph 2, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no?
No.
Noes, raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 noes. So that would be 5 to 6. It passes.
Any abstentions?
Any abstentions? It passes 6 to 5. So now we have the EDR as amended before us. Mr. Miller?
I just wanted to thank Mr. May for his very constructive efforts. And the irony of all this in lieu of zoning versus NCPC is that the local DC zoning commission is 40% federal.
Question before us is the EDR as amended. All in favor say aye. Opposed, no. It passes. I'm sure all those watching have been thrilled by this discussion. We're down to 3 people watching on the web.
I don't think that made it worse than normal.
Thank you for a very good discussion. Agenda item number 6A is an information presentation on climate adaptation emerging trends and applications for Washington, D.C. We have Ms. Tarse, and just by way of background, Mr. Hart has shown some interest in NCPC's involvement in climate adaptation planning. We have folks here from NASA who will speak practically to what's going on and provide a couple of kind of real-world examples.
Thank you.
And so we have Ms. Tarse for us. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon, members of the Commission. When we first planned to present to you, little did we know that we're going to get some help from Mother Nature to make our point on the importance of planning for the future impacts of climate change. By now, Sandy is a household name, and climate change has made the headlines as we talk about disaster recovery because of Sandy. So we recognize that there's still skepticism about the cause of these extreme weather events. After all, we've always had them. But the severity and frequency of these events have become a topic of importance among climate scientists. In the last 2 years alone, our region has experienced extreme heat and storm events, as I've shown on the slide. And as you may recall, we had one of the worst flooding in Washington in 2006 due to record rainfall that pounded the region for a whole week. The extensive flooding in the Federal Triangle in June of that year led us to conduct a multi-agency Federal Triangle stormwater drainage study. I reported the findings of the study to the Commission in October of 2011. Through our work on the Potomac Park levee and the Federal Triangle stormwater study, we've been asked to participate at many climate adaptation activities in the last 2 years. In particular, the stormwater study has been recognized as one of the best examples of downscaling flood prediction models and has been useful in the climate change discussions for being a representative study on how extreme precipitation can impact the National Capital area. Staff presented the findings of the stormwater study at the NOAA Climate Adaptation Planning Workshop held at the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments. We also contributed to the development of the Sustainable Communities Climate Adaptation Guidebook prepared by COG through an EPA Smart Growth Grant. Our agency also developed our Climate Adaptation Strategic Plan in response to the new White House CEQ requirements for meeting EO 13514. I'd like to take a couple of minutes to provide a brief background on this directive from the President and how it relates to our mission as an agency. On March 4, 2011, CEQ issued a set of implementing instructions for federal agency adaptation planning. The instructions inform agencies on how to integrate climate change adaptation into their planning, operations, policies, and programs, as recommended by the Interagency Climate Change Adaptation Task Force. As a central planning agency for the National Capital Region, NCPC is well positioned to contribute in developing a robust climate adaptation strategy to make the federal government resilient to extreme weather events in decades to come. One of the areas where we believe we can help is by facilitating the dialogue among the federal agencies in the National Capital on how to drill down their agency's climate adaptation strategies to their facilities and work together to identify the priorities for protecting the federal government's most vulnerable assets in the National Capital. It makes sense to extend the boundaries of the federal adaptation strategies at a precinct level, where buildings occupied by various federal agencies are clustered together. Based on our experience working together on the Federal Triangle Stormwater Drainage Study, we believe these agencies can benefit from a coordinated climate adaptation plan that takes into consideration the public infrastructure outside of their four walls and the climate adaptation actions of their neighbors. For 2013, we are focusing our efforts on building relationships with the Federal Adaptation Planning community and expanding our understanding of best practices and emerging trends in this field. Some of the questions we'd like to answer include, where can we find the best climate data for the region? Who are our critical partners? And what is the best approach that meets the needs and challenges of our partners? Our roadmap will lead to a shared vision and set of priorities for addressing climate change for the federal agencies in the national capital. To help us answer these questions, NASA staff has reached out to us to offer their expertise in climate science and climate adaptation planning. In the spring, we are partnering with NASA to conduct a workshop on climate change risk analysis for Washington, D.C. This would help staff identify the issues and impacts of climate change to federal properties in the national capital and guide our future work in climate adaptation planning. Today, we invited two of their most qualified staff to provide an overview on the science and methodology that we can employ in our future work in climate adaptation. Mr. Kim Tufektis is a facilities strategist and NASA's Facilities Master Planning Program Manager. An architect and planner, he leads an initiative to transform Apollo-era installations to advance 21st century research and exploration programs with particular responsibility for adapting to climate change. Today, Mr. Tufektis will talk about locally relevant climate models and how NASA's methodology and scientific data can be applied to federal facilities in a campus or at the district scale. Following Mr. Tufektis' presentation, Dr. Cynthia Rosenzweig will provide a brief overview of the emerging field of climate adaptation and the science behind it, using her work with New York City as co-chair of the New York City Panel on Climate Change. This would be an example of climate adaptation planning in an urbanized area, such as Washington, D.C. Dr. Cynthia Rosenzweig is a senior research scientist at the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies, where she heads the Climate Impacts Group. She also coordinated the writing of an entire chapter of the Fourth Assessment Report of the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC for short. The IPCC reports are recognized around the world as the most reliable source of climate change data, and the IPCC shared the Nobel Peace Prize with Vice President Al Gore in 2007 for this work. Please welcome Mr. Kim Tufektis and Dr. Cynthia Rosenzweig. And we will have an opportunity to ask them some questions later on.
Thank you, Amy. We at NASA appreciate the opportunity to present to this group. As a planner and an architect, the last time I got to present to this organization was 11 years ago when I was presenting a new or updated facilities master plan for NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center. Shortly after I had that opportunity, I changed jobs, and now I coordinate agency master planning across the agency at NASA's headquarters. When I arrived at NASA headquarters, a colleague of mine came to me and sat down in my new workspace and said, "I don't know if you're going to be comfortable with the conversation we're about to have, but I have a big problem for you." And he proceeded to sketch out for me some of the climate risks that NASA faced that we were not yet ready to respond to. Our facilities are generally close to sea level. Some of them are in areas where water, on the other hand, is a precious and scarce resource. We have many facilities that are unique, and therefore we can't move an activity easily from one site to another in order to solve problems. As a consequence, climate became a very significant risk to the success of a facilities program for my agency. So that's how I came to understand the problem that we have the great good fortune of being able to share with you today. That colleague and I work very closely together, he from an environmental management standpoint, me from a facilities management standpoint, recognized that we didn't have the expertise in order to really tackle this problem. So instead of going outside, we first began by wondering whether right within NASA, an agency known for its scientific research, that we could find a partner who could help us to connect together the science with our responsibilities as institutional stewards to find a solution that made sense. And we were very fortunate that that does exist within our agency, and as you've heard, Dr. Rosenzweig, one of the leaders at the Goddard Institute of Space Studies, a partnership between NASA and Columbia University in Manhattan, had focused exactly on these issues. This document had not yet come out at that time, but this is a report about the process that the Goddard Institute of Space Studies, as a consultant to Mayor Bloomberg and the City of New York, used to solve a similar problem for a different kind of institution than NASA. And we were fascinated. We opened a continuing discussion with the Goddard Institute of Space Studies, which has become an internal partnership to let us access the expertise in modeling, in being able to predict future climate change, in understanding past changes, to put in context for a facilities and environmental and human capital community the issues that we face going forward. So it's my pleasure now to be able to make this presentation really a transition between Amy's introduction, which takes care of most of the mechanics of introducing Cynthia, and just to say that I think you're in for a treat. Cynthia is a wonderful communicator, and I think that's really one of the aspects that comes with the science and the expertise that has made our partnership so powerful, has helped us to take many steps forward in terms of adapting, and Cynthia is going to describe that process and make some observations about how it connects with the City of New York and how she and we have worked that process to be ready for a federal circumstance. Cynthia?
Thank you, Kim. Let's see, can I get my presentation? Well, that's coming up. I want to thank Kim for the introduction, thank Amy for the introduction, and thank you to the commissioners for inviting me to come and share some of the experiences that we've had at NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies in New York, working with the City of New York to help them prepare for the climate risks that they are facing today, and have just even passed just faced on October 29th with Hurricane Sandy, and now and into the future. And it turns out that urban areas are emerging as really early responders, we say, to these climate risk issues, because cities have experience in dealing with challenging environmental issues for their citizens. There's a very practical level of governance. And so we see the leadership, not only, for example, we think in New York and some other cities, but also in cities around the world. So how did New York City set up addressing the increasing climate risks posed by climate change? And the first thing to notice is the word process at the top, because responding to climate change is a process. It's not at all a one-off thing. We're going to do one thing, we're going to build one seawall, and then we're all done and we can all go home. It's really addressing a long-term challenge issues, which we have today, and in the climate risks that we have today, and then realizing that these risks may change in the future. So in the New York City process, let's see, maybe I don't have my pop-ups. Yes, I do have my pop-ups. So it starts out with leadership. In New York City, we're fortunate to have Mayor Bloomberg, who is really a leader not only for our city but also worldwide on these issues. But that leadership is a very important part of establishing the process. It also takes coordination, because a city is a very complex set of
functional agencies, interacting transportation systems, energy systems, water systems, communities, et cetera. And so in New York City, we have an office called the Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability. And that office provided a very key coordination role in the process. On the bottom left is the Climate Change Adaptation Task Force that Mayor Bloomberg and the Sustainability Office established. And it incorporates, that task force incorporates all the major agencies and organizations that run the critical infrastructure of not only within the 5 boroughs, but of the entire New York metropolitan region. And this is not just public entities, but they're private as well, because, for example, all our telecom providers were part of this task force, and they're run by private corporations. So that task force met regularly across the different kinds of infrastructure on the order of I think it was quarterly, over the course of the first phase of this adaptation process. But then the groups themselves that ran the energy, transportation, water and waste and communication, they also met more frequently to discuss issues. But because of the interdependencies of infrastructure systems in cities, you need to have both people meeting with the folks who are facing the same challenges, but also so that those interdependencies can be addressed at the same time. On the right-hand side of this slide is the expert group called the New York City Panel on Climate Change that Bill Selecki from City University of New York and I were the co-chairs of. And this group provided the expert knowledge so that the decision makers could then decide what were the priority areas to address in the near term, medium term, and long term. And again, on the expert panel, it was also a mix of public and private. So there were university scholars, agency scholars, there were legal and insurance experts, and risk management professionals. Now, another aspect right from the beginning of thinking about adapting to climate risks and responding to this very challenging issue is to establish an approach. Because it can get very fine-grained. Well, what should we do with this bridge? And what should we do with this drain? And unless there is an overall approach, there's no real guidance to what everyone is actually aiming to do. What's the motivation? So in terms of how New York approached this, they approached it as a risk management issue. And the response to risk management, to the increasing risks, was to think about developing flexible adaptation pathways. Sometimes this is called resilience, climate resilience, and the city actually called it climate resilience, creating a climate resilient city. And just looking at the graph, you see that we're marching through time going forward, and this is on a decadal time scale, not just in the present, but for decades to come. And we see that what is happening with climate change, that's the blue line, is that the risks are increasing. The wavy blue line is what's called an acceptable societal level of risk. All communities have a set of acceptable levels of risk that could be tolerated. The issue that we face right now is that with the projections of climate change, those risks are projected to exceed the societal levels of risk. So what do? Do we create do we choose one thing and say, this is what we're going to do, that's the orange line? And you see that if we only choose one thing to do to prepare, we, maybe not right away, but we eventually cross the societal level of risk. So instead, the goal is to follow the pathway of the wavy lines along the bottom so that we can maintain our urban environments below that acceptable level of risk. So maybe it builds up for a while, actions are taken to reduce risk. Then if the climate continues to change as projected, more extensive interventions would be needed later on. And the reason why there's both a yellow and a green line in this approach is that with climate change, because of the nature of the greenhouse gas emissions that are the root cause of the change, we need as urban environments to be both working on reducing greenhouse gas emissions to reduce the ultimate magnitude of the risks, as well as responding to the inevitable changes, some of which have already begun and which are projected to increase in the future. So that's the overall approach. To actually then get down to, well, what are those specific set of adaptation strategies to pursue? What we helped create, what the expert panel helped to create, was a set of information and tools. And the stormwater report that Amy was showing is such an information and tool approach. So we created the foundation report that Kim just held up. And at the back of that are 3 workbooks that were for the folks in those agencies and organizations that run the infrastructure. There's one on climate risk information, which has what's happening with the climate now and what are the projections for the future. The second one was on adaptation assessment guidelines. How do you assess the risks? What's the process by which you can assess the risks? And the third was about climate protection levels, which began to address the first set of knowledge needed for how standards and regulations may need to change to open up that as an area of possible responses. The climate projections, there's an example of them on the bottom for New York. And we created these in a very interactive way so that we could create, the folks in the agencies asked us, would you please create tear sheets so we can print them out, put them up on our walls so we know what those projections are. And that's the example for air temperature, precipitation, sea level rise projections there, and then through the time slices of the decades in the future. Now, we brought along also, and I think we have some, Kim, we have some for the commission members, for the NASA program that we're working on together in NASA for all the NASA centers across the country. This is an example of the climate risk information that we develop with the center facilities managers and stewards and the climate scientists to begin that initial vulnerability assessment and development of adaptation strategies. So that's an example here. Now, what did we find for what are the stresses that we need to adapt to up in New York? And I think that these would be basically the same here in Washington, but of course, I think you all need to down here go through your process here so that you can come to those definition of what are the most risks, the highest risks that you face. But up in New York, it's extreme heat and heat waves, intense precipitation and flooding, mid-latitude cyclones, that's what we scientists call it, called nor'easters, which peak from November to April, and then of course, the tropical cyclones, the hurricanes, which peak August to September, but can also happen later. And then there's also potential for droughts. So these are the actual climate risks that New York undertook to begin to do a better job on preparing for. So this is the adaptation process that was developed with the city. And this is a very well-known method, really, for understanding and developing and responding to risks. So first you have to identify your current and future climate hazards. You conduct the inventory of infrastructure and assets and communities so that we can so that initial vulnerabilities can be identified. How can those risks be characterized? Which are high priority? Which are low priority? Every risk is not the same in terms of what really needs to be responded to. And then develop an initial list of strategies. This is very similar to what we've done at what we're doing with the NASA centers in the NASA program as well. We identify opportunities for coordination. That's absolutely critical for these interdependent systems that we're addressing here. And then prioritizing strategies. What can be done right early on, and what needs to be put off, or what can be put off, for example, as capital cycles come up in terms of repair to existing infrastructure. Then, when we have all this information, then we can prepare and implement resilience plans or the adaptation plans, such as Amy was describing. Number 8 is an incredibly important part of the process. Monitor and reassess. There's a lot of uncertainty about climate change. We don't know what pathway climate change is actually going to take. We always present ranges of what those uncertainties are. And as we go, but we do know that it is projected to be a long-term process. So what we need to be doing is monitoring what's happening with our weather and our climate in our urban areas, monitoring what's going on with climate science, our understanding of what's happening to the global system, and then revisit our adaptation strategies to see what's working, what's not working, what do we need to adjust, so that we can be on an effective and efficient adaptation pathway in a flexible manner. So let's think about just very briefly, well, when we say climate adaptation, well, what does that actually mean? What sorts of things would this entail? So first of all, what are the goals? To reduce the level of physical, social, and economic impacts of climate, and to take advantage, in some cases, perhaps of new opportunities. This is very important. Warmer winters may help people with their heating bills. Not every single thing associated with climate change is necessarily bad, and that's also, I think, very important in the framing. So on the adaptations, there are many different types. The first one is management and operations. There's a lot of things that can be done just right now. So for example, in the New York area, when they realized that we were having increased flooding, not from multi-century storms like Sandy, but just from our normal rainstorms, our DOT sends out the crews ahead of those storms and makes sure that the drains are clean. This is this is just very simple. Operations and management, we can do a better job on this. There are lots of things, scores of things that can be done, very short-term, inexpensive, that we can get going to do a better job. But there are some things, moving on to the next category, which really do involve infrastructure and refitting our infrastructure so that it can withstand these the projected changes. And there, using the capital cycle to then see, well, can we incrementally retrofit our infrastructure at that time? What do we need to do can we make plans so that we can add and change in the future if we have to, as well as perhaps in some cases build new seawalls if indeed we need to. And then, of course, there are policies with zoning and regulations. These can be done by different groups, private and public organizations, at different scales of government, different levels of government, of course, local, municipal, county, state, and national. And these level of efforts, as I said, can be both incremental, but we need to be ready when after doing careful study and feasibility study, that there may need to be large-scale shifts as well. And I mentioned about the timing. The adaptation planning process will help to prioritize what needs to be done in the short term, medium term, and long term. Realizing also that there may be abrupt changes. That's an important concept in climate science, that there may be tipping points in which things get much worse, and that we do need to be ready for that potential. I'm just going to end by giving a few specific thoughts about Hurricane Sandy. So first of all, the storm scientifically was forecast very well in advance. You see the middle one are the models showing the storm tracks with that very, very unusual turn to the west. Sandy had the lowest recorded central pressure north of Cape Hatteras, probably for over 75 to 100 years. And it was exceptionally large with the wind fields on 500 miles from the centers. And those winds went up to 60 miles and higher, up to 60 miles an hour. So on the science side, we did have a good handle on it. What about the impacts of the storm? Well, as Kim and Amy were saying, we've been working with New York City since actually the first study that we did was in 2001. Actually, it was part of the first national assessment, U.S. national assessment of climate variability and change. And many of the impacts that occurred with Sandy were forecast well in advance as well. You can go back to our very first report and find many of the things that happened in the areas that were the most vulnerable, such as the subway stations, beach erosion and the boardwalk damage in the Rockaways, the extensive power outages with 8 million people across the U.S., about 4 million people in the New York City area lost power. All 3 major airports were closed, 3 tunnels, the 7 subway lines under the East River. We had the New Jersey yards were metropolitan rail yards were closed, were flooded. And we have to also, 2 important, probably most important impacts. First, loss of life. Over 40 people died in the storm in the New York City area, about 100 in the United States, about 200 if you include the full range of the storm in the Caribbean. And then, of course, finally, the economics. The estimates of damage of the storm are roughly about $60 billion, of which that was the $60 billion was what was requested for the recovery funds, of which about $10 billion were just awarded, actually, just a few days ago. So how, with Hurricane Sandy, does this get linked to the climate risk that I was talking about? Any one storm cannot be said as climate change. But the flooding, the extensive coastal flooding that we did see with Sandy is related to climate change, because in New York City we have had 1 foot of sea level rise already over the last 100 years, of which a portion of that is related to the global warming and the global ocean temperatures, which expand the ocean water and leads to sea level rise. The storm itself, we can't say for sure. But what we saw in New York, that because of the advanced planning, there already were actions underway in New York City that mitigated some of the impacts. They have been planting green streets with vegetation that absorb stormwater. They've been getting ready with high-resolution LiDAR elevation data. They've been incorporating sea level rise into the comprehensive waterfront plan, and they launched, you can see on the slide, there was already a communication plan about the evacuation, and up-to-date evacuation plans were in place. Everything can always be improved. There were issues with nursing homes. Of course, there were issues with hospitals. There were many, many issues. But New York was not caught completely by surprise. There had been advanced planning. Now, in the wake of Sandy, all of these efforts are intensifying, and across all the types of the adaptation strategies that were on the previous slide: operations and management, infrastructure planning, the urban design and policies, standards and regulations. All of these now are on the table to be utilized and to take the potential climate changes into account, these increasing risks, as New York recovers and rebuilds after Sandy. So to conclude, the adaptation process that was developed in New York can be modified for use and needs to be modified for use because nothing should be taken in a cookie cutter way. But we're happy to share what we've learned, and it has been modified for use. And these same basic approaches are what we are using in NASA for the NASA centers across the country. The response actions are already underway in New York, and they did help to reduce damages. I am absolutely sure that there would have been more loss of life and more damage if New York had not begun already to respond to climate risks. The recommendations going forward include a portfolio approach of climate risk management and operations and management, infrastructure planning, and policies. And then finally, we do need to remember that as we go forward, we need to think about reducing greenhouse gas emissions to reduce the ultimate levels of risk, as well as adaptation measures to deal with the climate changes that are already taking place and for those increasing risks of extreme events that climate change is projected to bring. I'm happy to answer any questions and discuss. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a question. In your models of low-lying coastal urban settings, do you have models or tools that in a 3D sort of way will demonstrate, if you plug in what the sea level rise is and what a storm surge might be, what the inundation would look like on an
Yes, we do.
coastal urban setting?
Yes, we do.
And how available are those tools? Do you make those tools available to municipalities?
We, in fact, work already not only with NASA, but with NOAA and their Digital Coast website and their and the tools that they have. And we have been actually on we've been having telecoms with them since Sandy because we are working with them so that the sea level rise projections can be added in to those national coastal databases.
Follow up on that. Has there been an opportunity to post-Sandy run those models and plug in the variables of sea level rise and storm surge to see how accurate they were with what actually happened?
Yes, very much so. And in fact, FEMA has, since Sandy, they actually have created an update of their above board, it's ABFEs, flood elevations, because there were the Sandy flooding revealed that there were issues in what those 1 in 100 year storm projections were. So there is an active effort to update the base flood elevations and then to see where the sea level rise projections add on to that, because that is the way that we can actually get them to be more accurate.
Thank you. Mr. Provincia.
A couple of points. Thank you. Your timing was excellent. There was an cover story yesterday in the Washington Post about just getting warmed up, and it talked about,
yes.
I appreciate you giving the Fox News Fair and Balanced report. Flooding is of interest in our region, while drought in other areas. In the Midwest, only slightly behind the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, 9 million acres of wildfires in the West and so forth. So appreciate that. It appears to what we're seeing is an increase in the number, the frequency, the severity, and the duration, which is a way that we describe many environmental and occupational noise exposure and others. We're seeing that in the climate. It appears that one of your takeaways is to do a threat analysis and a vulnerability assessment on a national, local, and regional level. Does NASA provide services like that on either a gratis or a reimbursable basis to federal agencies?
Well, the...
Besides just making information available, would you come in and
I'll
analyze
say one thing, and
an
then
area?
we can follow on. Just the U.S. Global Change Research Program and the Office of Science Technology Policy are conducting right now a U.S. national assessment, which is that national climate assessment. So, and that is multi-agency, multi-region, all many hundreds and hundreds of stakeholders involved. So that's going on nationally, but we certainly want to talk about the NASA and
Sure.
providing our information.
As an institutional steward, I have worked with Cynthia and others to adapt the process that she described so it would work better for a federal installation or federal property. And in so doing, we've held now workshops at about 6 of our 14 major locations, covering about 80% of our land, about 65% of our real property value. And so we're making progress. We don't make that progress alone, and we have invited other federal agencies to participate in our workshops, learn from our process, join us and look for synergies in the way we respond to the shared problems. So I think we handed out the Kennedy Space Center handout, and there we're located with the Air Force at Cape Canaveral, and so of course we invited Canaveral to join us. They were in the process of updating their master plan, so we can now report that they changed their master plan and relocated launch sites further from the beach in response to having been able to participate with us. GSA has been a partner on this, and members of the High Performance Sustainable Buildings organization within GSA have been participating with us. And last, at the end of this month, in cooperation with the Federal Facilities Council, as Amy mentioned, we're holding a workshop here in this area which will simulate. We have only one day to do it, so it will simulate the kinds of experiences that any federal agency may have. We're going to use Washington, D.C. We have provided data that comes from the downscaled modeling process that the Goddard Institute of Space Studies uses. So that information is available to any federal agency that wants to come join us and is focused on the Washington area. And of course, we're coordinating with staff here at the National Capital Planning Commission.
I would assume another one of your partners in both the pre-event planning as well as the post-event response would be the Corps of Engineers. I know, for example, that the New York District of the North Atlantic Division documented that they pumped something like 475 million gallons of water out of the tunnels and were a key participant in the recovery.
Yes, very much so, and we have worked with them since our very first report.
Last question on return on investment. It appears that Sandy, for example, in those 4 affected states, the total bill is about $60 billion. Do we have a rough order of magnitude return on investment based on the current pre-event planning and mitigation efforts that were in place? With that planning and mitigation in place, the damage was $60 billion. What's the cost, for example, of mitigating future Sandy-like events? Is that $5 billion, $10 billion? What's the I'm more interested in mitigation as opposed to repair and recovery.
Right.
I'm just seeing if you have a return on investment calculation.
The exact calculations have not been done.
Right.
New York City is undertaking some of those. I know with consulting firms that they have.
And that may vary from area to area. You talked about the level of risk acceptance by municipalities.
That's right. That's right. But I think that there's a rule of thumb that for every dollar invested in risk reduction, it's a four-fold savings.
4 to 1. Okay.
That's the rough rule of thumb.
Mr. Hart. I thank you for your presentation, and I'm struck by the parallel that this process takes with the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000, where every state and every jurisdiction was required to provide to the federal government a plan to mitigate natural hazards. It did not require private institutions, campuses, installations, or federal agencies to do that. But the process you described was exactly what DMA 2K required, with the exception of a cost and benefit consideration, which obviously has to play into the prioritization. I think that having good climate information is essential for bringing those plans up to date. So I think it's a lesson to us all. We've got changes afoot, and we need to be looking ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
It's been terrific. Is there anything else to come before the commission from commissioners?
We'd just like to publicly thank the executive director and Ms. Young for their support. We had a very productive visit yesterday to Fort Belvoir. We thank them for their participation and their support for the logistics planning that made that very successful. More than half of the commissioners were able to attend and participate, so very beneficial. Thank you.
Terrific. That's terrific. Mr. Miller.
Yes, on behalf of your fellow commissioners, I'd just like to congratulate you on your reappointment.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Amen.
Thank you very much. It's been a terrific meeting. Thanks to all who attended, and we are adjourned.